Hi guys, I hope you're doing well, and in this video we are going to be discussing about the limitations of the cardinal utility theory. Now we already know that the cardinal utility theory was given by a very famous economist. His name was Alfred Marshall. You can mention that in the exam. And he said that utility, that is satisfaction, can actually be measured in absolute quantitative numbers, and we have already seen that in the previous videos on this playlist as well. And so basically Marshall's theory, in his theory, according to him, the concept of utility was totally cardinal. That is, it could be measured in numbers. And now the point is that why are we actually studying this topic? Why are we actually studying the limitations of the cardinal utility theory approach? Now that is something that we really need to know, because so that we can answer the past paper questions perfectly. Now guys, you need to understand that oftentimes it is tested in the A2 past papers that how effective utility theory is in guiding the consumer equilibrium, or how effective is the utility theory of consumer behavior really effective in achieving consumer equilibrium, or how effective is that theory in sort of maximizing total utility and total consumer surplus for consumers, and how effective the equi-marginal principle is. So if you're talking about the equi-marginal principle and you conclude that, okay, fine, that Alfred Marshall's theory of utility gives us a framework regarding the law of demand, it gives us a framework regarding the consumer behavior, the equi-marginal principle. So in that sense, we make a lot of assumptions when we are actually making that theory. So while evaluating and discuss questions regarding how effective the utility theory is for especially the cardinal utility theory of Alfred Marshall, we need to make sure that we mention the shortcomings, we mention the limitations of the theory, because these limitations, these limitations challenges the effectiveness of the cardinal utility theory approach of measuring a demand, cardinal utility theory approach of guiding consumer behavior, and the cardinal utility theory approach where the equi-margin principle is equi-margin principle derives the maximization of total utility for a consumer behavior, or where the equi-margin principle derives rational consumer behavior. So fine, we agree that yes, consumers are rational, and we're not by these limitations does not invalidate the Alfred Marshall's theory. Yeah, so it's not that because you're studying these limitations, so Alfred Marshall's utility theory is totally void or absurd. It's not that. But you could obviously, as an economist, we will always argue, we will always be challenging those theories, and we will always be mentioning their limitations and discuss questions as well, right? So, and to score these maximum marks, you need to mention those limitations. So what you can write is, so like I've written that students are required to mention them while answering discuss questions that talk about how effective utility theory is in analyzing the consumer behavior or the consumer equilibrium, right? In guiding consumer rationality, how effective would consumers rationally act? Because utility theory is assuming that consumers act rationally, utility theory, and based on their rationality, based on that rationality that it is assuming that consumers are rational, consumer equilibrium is reached, right? Based on the assumption that consumers are rational. So there are a lot of assumptions that this utility theory makes, and we are going to challenge that assumption. So basically, you could also talk about. So one of the paragraphs that you could write in your past paper answers is that you could write that cardinal utility theory is one of the oldest theories of demand. Yes, correct, guys. It is one of the oldest theories of demand, and it's actually providing an explanation of consumers' demand. Obviously, we have already seen the previous videos that it is providing an explanation of consumers' demand for a product, and basically and that actually derives the law of demand, and that law of demand basically is establishing, we already studied in the previous videos, it establishes the inverse relation between price and quantity demanded. So guys, while criticizing the cardinal utility theory approach, you could write that John Richard Hicks was basically the first to criticize this theory. Okay, so this is a good point that most people will not mention, but if you mention it, that will definitely give you an edge over others. You must say, in fact, that we know that the law of equi-margin principle is actually explaining us consumer behavior. So yes, the law of equi-margin principle explains us consumer behavior, but you could say that it is not necessary. I mean, obviously it is explaining consumer behavior. The law of because the law of equimarginal principle is measuring utility in cardinal numbers, right? We are measuring the utility in cardinal numbers. We are measuring utility in utils, right? So basically, I mean, and that actually explains, based on certain assumptions, it's explaining that consumers are acting rational and total consumer surplus is maximized and total utility is maximized in that sense, because we're allocating our expenditures based on the equimargin principle. But you could say, because you're critiquing that logic, you're critiquing that theory, you will say that it is not necessary. Perfect evaluation, guys, superb, it will kill it. You could say that it's not necessary that all the people exactly, understand this, exactly followed this law. Which law? That is the law of equimargin principle. That is entirely based on measuring utility in cardinal numbers, right? And who stated that you can measure utility in cardinal numbers? Alfred Marshall. So basically, it's not necessary that all the people follow this law in the allocation of their money income, right? So you can write this. And obviously, in having said that, obviously, if not everyone will follow this law, so obviously, all may not obtain maximum satisfaction. So since the equimargin principle is saying that consumers are rational and everyone will, obtain maximum utility and obtain maximum satisfaction based on, assuming that they act rationally and they achieve the maximum total utility and total consumer surplus. Having said that, you could write that it's not necessary that all people will follow this law in their allocation of money income, and since they will not follow this law, not everyone may obtain maximum satisfaction. So first evaluation, first critique that you can give. So guys, cardinal utility approach, has been subjected to severe criticisms, and Hicks, we know that he was the first to criticize this theory, and because of those criticisms, alternative views to the consumer behavior, alternative theories such as the indifference curve analysis, it came into existence, right? So guys, the reason why cardinal utility theory is severely criticized is because it's entirely based on certain important assumptions, and those assumptions, the problem is that those assumptions on which it is based, they have been regarded as being quite unrealistic. That is what you can write in the exam, that those assumptions have been quite regarded as being unrealistic. So for example, one of those assumptions is that utility, is measurable, and utility is a quantifiable entity. It's a quantifiable measure. Utility is a quantifiable measure, and that is one of the assumptions that has been severely criticized by Hicks as well. And guys, we've already seen in the previous videos that according to Marshall, the marginal utility is basically measurable in terms of money. So Marshall said that yes, you can sort of measure the marginal utility in money terms, while later on there were some other economists as well who supported the cardinal view, and they said that utility can also be measured in utils, right? So either you're measuring utility in utils or you're measuring utility in terms of money. How much money you're paying is for a good is representing the amount of utility or the satisfaction that you're gaining. In either case, whether you're measuring in terms of money or you're measuring it in utils, you are measuring or giving a quantifiable significance to utility, and that was a severe criticism that made that made the cardinal utility approach look quite unrealistic, right? So guys, while evaluating the cardinal utility approach, you could say that according to Hicks, what did he say? That according to Hicks, utility is cardinally immeasurable. He said that you cannot measure utility cardinally, because he said that utility, according to him, utility was a psychological feeling. So you can't really measure a psychological feeling in quantifiable objective numbers, and that is why according to him, the cardinal measurability of utility was quite unrealistic, because the simple reason is that the cardinal utility was actually based on a simple assumption. The assumption was that utility can be, because we made that assumption, and now we're challenging that assumption in evaluation. So the assumption was that utility can be measured in absolute, objective and quantitative terms. That is basically we were doing. We were simply assuming, it was assumed that in the entire utility analysis, that it is simply cardinally measurable, right? But in actual practice, in real terms, we know that utility cannot be measured in such, quantitative or cardinal terms, and that's what Higgs claimed, right? So, guys, the fact that utility is a psychic feeling and it's a subjective thing. It's a psychic feeling. It's a subjective thing. So you cannot measure utility in quantitative terms. So, guys, basically in real life, like consumers like me and you are only able to compare, right? We're only able to compare. Remember, we are only able to basically compare what we're only able to compare the satisfaction, right? We're only able to compare the satisfaction that is derived from consuming various goods or services or consuming various combinations of the goods or services, right? So a practical real life consumer can only say, or he can only state, only state that whether a certain good, or maybe let's say a combination of goods, gives him more satisfaction or less satisfaction, or maybe equal satisfaction, as compared to the other good. And exactly that is why Higgs was of the opinion, or the assumption, that cardinal measurement of utility is unrealistic, and he said that it should be completely given up. Now, guys, another critique of the utility theory is that the hypothesis of the utility, being independent, that is, a utility being independent of other goods, is incorrect. Now, I'll explain it to you what it actually means, right? So basically, the thing is that the utility analysis is basically assuming that the utilities that are derived from consuming various goods are basically independent of each other. So, for example, if you're consuming good A and you're consuming good B, so the overall utility from consuming good A basically depends upon the quantity of good A consumed, and the utility from good B depends upon the quantity of good B consumed. And if you sum up all the goods A that you have consumed and the goods B that you have consumed, and if you sum that up, you get a total utility from the consumption of good A and good B. That's what the utility theory is assuming, right? And obviously, as you're consuming good A and good B, the law of diminishing utility applies, and we know that. And that's how that's how you based on the equal marginal principle, you're equating your expenditure between two goods, and you're consuming certain quantities of good A and good B, and you're maximizing a total utility. But the fact is that the entire assumption is based on the fact that the utilities that are derived from good A and good B are independent of each other, right? Which, and that's exactly what I've written over here, that we are assuming that the utilities derived for various goods are independent, which actually means that the utility which a consumer derives, right? This is what you will write in the exam, that the utility from the consumer derives from a good is basically the result of the consumption of the quantity of that good alone, right? It is a result of the consumption of that quantity of that good and of that good alone, which means that if you consume good A and the more good A you consume, and you just keep on consuming good A, so the overall utility that you will derive from consuming good A would be the sum of the individual utilities that you have consumed for each quantity, for each quantity. Now, which means that this assumption is kind of, not really, it doesn't apply in real life, because, and that's what we are critiquing here, that the assumption of the independent utilities, that's what you will write, it is implying that the utility which a consumer obtains from a good, from consuming, let's say, good A, or let's say consuming tea, or maybe coffee, or maybe a pen, does not depend upon, it is not depending upon the quantity consumed of the other good. So if I'm consuming tea, so the utility that I will derive from consuming tea would be depending upon how many units of tea that I'm consuming. And the utility is basically satisfaction. And the satisfaction from consuming tea would not depend on the, let's say, the amount of coffee available, or whether coffee is available or not. But in actual life, the amount of satisfaction I get from tea also depends upon the amount of coffee that is available, because coffee is a substitute for tea, right? And I'll explain this in a bit, because it quite makes sense, and this will become a crucial part of your evaluation of utility theory as well. So the entire utility theory is assuming that it kind of depends upon the quantity that you're purchasing of that individual good alone, right? And it's not depending upon the quantity that is available for other goods. So we need to understand that. Having said that, what you can write is that the total utility a person will get from the whole collection of goods or goods that are purchased by him is basically the total sum of the separate utilities of the various goods. So what you can say is that the utility function or the utility concept is basically additive, right? It's not, I'm not saying addictive, I'm saying additive. That is, you're adding the individual utilities that you're deriving from good A or good B, right? But the point is that in real life, this does not happen. In actual life, the utility or the satisfaction that you're deriving from a good, from a particular good, depends upon the availability of other goods as well, or some other goods as well. And those some other goods might either be, let's say, substitutes, or they could also be complements. And the utility theory is a kind of ignoring this fact, right? So you would say that the utility that you are deriving from consuming a pen, depends upon whether there is, ink available or not. So the ink is the complement to the pen, right? It's a complementary good. Pen and ink are complementary good. They are jointly demanded. So the utility that you are deriving from a pen depends upon the whether there's ink available or no ink available, right? So guys, what you could say is that, for example, if you have tea, right? And if I have tea, so obviously if I have tea alone, then the utility I will derive from tea would obviously be much greater. But at the same time, if I also have coffee, so if along with tea I'm also having coffee along with tea, right? And tea and coffee are substitutes. So the utility that I will get from tea will be less, because now I also have a substitute available as well, and I'm also, let's say, consuming that substitute. So the point is that the utility that I will derive from the consumption of, guys, tea would also be dependent on the fact that I had coffee as well. So because tea and coffee are substitutes. So let's say if I have coffee right now, and then if I have tea again, so the utility that I will derive from tea will be much less. But the utility theory is ignoring this fact. The utility theory is just saying that, what, I will have, certain amount of utility from the second cup of tea based on the fact that I already had the first cup and now I'm having the second cup. So my utility will be much less because, diminishing utility sets in. And that's right, that's fine. But again, the utility that I'm getting from the second cup is not only dependent upon the fact that I'm just having the second cup of tea, you know, it's also dependent on the fact that I just had coffee, which was a substitute of tea, right? So I'm kind of getting my craving satisfied from coffee as well, which is a very close, let's say, substitute. So the utility that I will get from consuming tea will also depend on the fact that, I had coffee available, and this obviously makes sense, right? So it's quite clear that, various goods are related to each other, in the sense that some are complements and some are substitutes, and because of this, the utilities that are derived from various goods are interdependent. This is what you will write. They are interdependent. They are not independent. They are interdependent. That is, they depend upon each other. Therefore, the utility that the utility that you obtain from a good is not based on the quantity of that particular good consumed alone, but also depends upon the existence of the consumption of other, related goods. And those related goods could be substitutes and they could be complements, right? So it's quite a interesting phenomenon. If you write this in your essay, you will nail it, right? So this is what you're supposed to say. And because of this, that is what made the utility theory less effective. It raises questions on the effectiveness of utility theory in achieving consumer equilibrium, because we're just saying that, from this certain good we're getting this certain amount of utility, and the consumer surplus is maximized and total utility is maximized. But hang on a second, we're saying that, this is the total utility that we're getting from this, certain good consumed, but we're also ignoring the fact that the utility that we're getting is not only from the consumption of those units, but we are ignoring the fact that the utility we were getting from a certain unit was not based on the consumption of that unit alone, but it was also based on the fact that we just had maybe a substitute, or there were complements available as well, and those complements have a direct impact on the utility that I will obtain from the consumption of that particular good. And so the utility theory is ignoring that fact, and that raises questions on the effectiveness of the utility. So this is how you're supposed to write in the exam. You won't write in the exam by saying, you know what, the disadvantages are as follows and stuff. This is quite a childish or the wrong way to write in an exam. You need to be quite normative, and your economic expression should be like, oh, you know what, we are not denying the effectiveness, but then it raises certain questions, and we are criticizing those assumptions that brings the effectiveness into question, right? This is how you write in the exam. So another critique that you can make of the marginal utility theory is that, you could say that for applying, if you're applying the law of equimarginal utility in real life or practical life, the consumer has to, weigh up in his mind on its own. He has to weigh up the marginal utilities of the different commodities, right? And in order to do that, he must calculate those marginal utilities per dollar and then compare, because obviously we know what the equimargin principle is. The consumer is actually calculating the marginal utility per dollar of A versus the marginal utility per dollar of B, and then he's comparing that which is giving him higher marginal utility per dollar, and then he's going for that good. So the point is that in reality, right, this is what you would write, that in reality, I mean, just the consumer doesn't works like. I mean, in reality, the consumer will not work like it. It's not that the consumer will just work on or just mentally calculate with a calculator in his hand, or maybe even in his head as well. That I mean, it's things are not so sophisticated and scientific or calculated in real practical life. I mean, there are many influences on the consumer. There are many influences on the consumer that will restrict his ability to act rationally. It's not that a consumer will be, just keep on equating the marginal utilities per dollar of A and B and then going for it accordingly. So those limitations will restrict the ability of the consumer to act rationally. And then so the assumption that the utility theory is making, that the consumer will always act rationally, is not true. I mean, it's easier being said than done. So the assumption that consumer always acts rationally does not hold true in real sense. And guys, like I said, that consumers will not always act rational. They will act irrationally. They may act irrationally, and there could be a lot of reasons for them, not showing clear rationality or not showing clear judgment and making effective decisions. Because you know consumers could be, let's say, under the influence of advertising and promotion. One Because advertising and promotion can have a clear impact on consumer rationality, because it may lead consumers making decisions that are not in their best interest, or it may lead to consumers making decisions that is not maximizing their consumer surplus and total utility. But despite that, consumers will still end up buying a product and not, acting rationally. And you could say that the consumers are not buying according to what the equi-margin principle was suggesting, or let's say the consumers are not buying according to, if it's a single commodity, then they're not buying, according to the fact that the price is equal to marginal utility. Then they're not using this rule. And because price equals to marginal utility simply is the fact that marginal benefit equals marginal cost, and this is just rational consumer behavior. So consumers are not doing that. They're not equating their marginal benefit with marginal cost. They're not acting rationally because of maybe advertising or promotion. And persuasive advertising can have that impact. Let's say persuasive advertising could force me to buy something, and I may act irrationally. So even though, let's say I'm paying a price, let's say I'm paying $300 for something, and the utility that I am getting is, let's say, only worth $200, right? So here you could say that the I mean, they're not equal. If the price is not equal to marginal utility, neither is the marginal benefit equal to marginal cost, right? The benefit is, let's say, worth $200, while the cost is $300, but still I'm buying it. The reason being that I am acting irrationally, and is I am under the influence of advertising. So advertising can have that impact. So I may just buy it, maybe like, it could be sort of impulsive decisions being made, or impulse buying, you could say, right? So you could write that in your exam. Another reason why consumers may act irrationally is that, they might be under the influence of the decisions of others. So for example, if my friend is doing something, even though it's not in my best interest, even though it's not, so maybe for him, it's in his best interest, but it's not in my best interest. So for example, if my consumer is buying a chocolate, right, or he's buying any product, and let's say he's paying $10 for it, and the utility, let's say, that he obtains is, for him, it's worth $10. So he has acted rationally and he's maximized his surplus. But the point is, and he's maximized his utility, but let's say for me the product might be worth only $7, while I may end up buying it for $10, just because of the fact that my friend was doing so, right? So I am not, equating my marginal benefit and marginal cost, and neither I'm equating my buying or my expenditure is not based on the consumer equilibrium where price equals to marginal utility, right? So it's not based on those lines. So again, like I said, so it's not practical that the consumer will always equate his marginal utility with price. So it's not always going to happen that way, and consumers may act irrational, I may act irrational, I may just end up buying it because my friend was doing so, right? And that's what I've written, that decisions may not always be based on what others are doing. Even decision may be based on what others are doing, even if it's not in our best interest, right? And at times, certain behaviors are, let's say, habitual, right? It's certain goods might be habit forming. So I may just keep on buying it, and for me, the utility of the additional unit might not decline, right? Maybe let's say if I'm smoking and I'm smoking a cigarette, and if after the second unit might, I can't really comment with certainty that the second unit of cigarette will, for me the utility will diminish because it's habit forming. In fact, it might be so addictive that it might give me more utility, and in fact I will crave for a third one as well. So, so you could also give this example as well. Otherwise, you could say that consumers exhibit a preference, and exactly the thing is that certain consumers may demonstrate or exhibit a preference for the way things currently are. Let's say maybe certain thing has been happening a certain way, so I might not be willing to switch to a new product, even though the new product is basically in my best interest. I may not want to switch to a new product, even though the new product was giving me more total utility or higher consumer surplus. And new product would give me, like I said, a high utility and consumer surplus, but still I will consume the old product, because the reason that you will give in the exam is that because that old product is simple my habit. It's my habit to consume it, and that's it. So habit basically overshadows or overpowers or offsets the rationality of a consumer, right? Now, guys, another critique that you could say is that the utility theory is basically assuming that the quality of the each successive unit or each additional unit is the same. Now, that's a ridiculous assumption, because not all units have the same shape or quality, right? So the theory, and that's exactly what I've written, that the theory is assuming that each successive unit is the same quality, that is consistent quality, and they are totally 100% identical. Now, that's a ridiculous assumption, right? Because we are assuming that. So it may be possible that the second, maybe if the first ice cream yielded me certain utility, and the second ice cream, let's say, is of much better quality, right? The second unit of ice cream or the second scoop maybe is of much better quality, or maybe has a bit more quantity as well. And in that sense, the marginal utility that I will derive from the second ice cream will be higher than the first one. But on the other hand, the diminishing marginal utility says that the marginal utility from the second ice cream will diminish, right? Because the utility theory, where we are measuring the utility in cardinal numbers, says that the value of the utility will basically reduce as more units are consumed, based on the diminishing marginal utility principle. And we're assumed, but that assumption is based on the fact that each unit is exactly identical and of consistent quality. But if the second ice cream is much better, it may yield me a higher utility than the first one. And that invalidates or raises questions on the entire concept of diminishing utility theory. Hence, the marginal utility may not diminish as compared to the first scoop of ice cream, right? Also, you could also write, that in some cases, the satisfaction that you're getting, or the utility or the enjoyment that you're getting, may, instead of going down, rise. Because let's say for me, if I am a car collector, I like having a collection of cars at my house, right? Let's say I collect maybe antique cars or something. So for a person like me, I may have interest in collecting cars. So for me, the diminishing marginal utility may not apply in this case. Why? Because if I like having a car collection, I may obtain a car, and then the second unit of car or the third unit of car will obtain me more utility or a greater satisfaction than the first unit of car, because now I have three cars and I'll be really happy for the fact that, I have three cars, and the fourth car will maybe, give me more utility. So each additional car will give me greater utility, and hence that, because my objective is to collect cars, right? And so it doesn't apply in this case. So so yeah, guys, I mean, you can clearly see that there have been severe criticisms regarding the utility theory that makes utility theory, the assumptions that the utility theory is making, question. They question the assumptions, and these critiques kind of, I mean, puts the entire utility theory into question regarding the effectiveness, and that is what you will write in the exam. And guys, because of that, remember, because of these criticisms, because of these critiques that were made, that is why basically an alternative approach was used, which was the indifference indifference analysis, which I will be discussing in my coming videos about the indifference analysis, because the indifference analysis is not measuring the amount of utility, but in fact it is ranking the combination. Instead of measuring the utility in numbers, it's actually ranking the various combinations and basically the order of preference, which is the, the ordinal utility approach, and I'll be discussing that in my coming videos in the same playlist. So guys, that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. You understood what the limitations of the cardinal utility theory is. If you have understood, please mention it in the comments. I will be reading and responding to those comments as well. Do share the video and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you all in my next video, where we will start with the indifference analysis. Until then, guys, take care.